Several hours later, Lu Sheng went to Lingsu's laboratory. As soon as he entered, he was attended by a brown-haired receptionist who immediately became nervous upon seeing him. She placed both hands on her chest and with a trembling voice asked if she could help him with something. Lu Sheng started looking at the receptionist and calmly asked if Lingsu was in the laboratory. As she looked at him more closely, she thought he was a very handsome man. While she was blushing, she reached out her hands towards Lingsu's laboratory, and with a nervous smile, she explained to him that Lingsu was in the laboratory. She offered to take him there. Just before she could finish speaking, Lu Sheng put his hands in his pockets as usual, turned his back to her, started heading towards Lingsu's laboratory and replied that it wasn't necessary. Another receptionist with blue hair named Lai approached her, put her hand near her mouth, and whispered to get her attention, asking if she had been mesmerized. While she was mesmerized looking at Lu Sheng, she heard the voice of her colleague and snapped out of her trance. She couldn't help but blush and fall in love with him. She replied to her friend that she didn't know and also asked who this handsome man was. Upon hearing this, Lai approached her, started pointing at the ceiling with her finger, and with a smile explained that she had heard that Lu Sheng was Lingsu's distant cousin. She also added that compared to him, all the popular boys in school were nothing. According to the rumors, he was not only handsome but also a martial arts genius, being the champion of the Dinglan martial arts tournaments in his country, and recently finishing first in another major martial arts tournament. Upon hearing this, she couldn't help but blush even more and fall even more in love with Lu Sheng. She turned her head towards him with a loving look and asked if he really was that impressive. She wanted a chance to see him again. At the same time in the laboratory, Lingsu was wearing a lab coat and holding a test tube containing a green liquid. She began to look at the liquid and became lost in her thoughts. Several seconds later, Lu Sheng entered her laboratory and asked if everything was ready. Upon hearing Lu Sheng's voice, Lingsu snapped out of her thoughts, turned towards him, looked into his eyes, extended her hand to the side, and with a smile replied yes, adding that everything was inside. Lu Sheng began to put on his lab coat, started looking at the test tube, and praised her for doing a good job. Lingsu approached him, stood behind him, placed one hand on his shoulder and the other on his arm, turned her head towards him and explained that her mother's situation had started again. After saying this, she asked him when he would be able to help her again. Lu Sheng put on his mask, started touching his nose with his finger, slightly turned his head towards her, and with a serious look asked her not to worry because he already knew about her mother's situation. He also added that as soon as he finished what he was working on, he would go to help her as soon as possible. After saying this, he turned his back on her, started looking at the ground, and began to move away from her. She placed her hand on her chest, clenched her fist tightly, and while watching Lu Sheng gradually moving away, she realized that his energy had become much stronger again. While she had her hand on her chest, she began to look at Lu Sheng with a worried expression as it hadn't been long since they last met. She couldn't help but question if someone could really change their martial arts level so much in just 1 year. To her, Lu Sheng was terrifying. Lu Sheng approached the table and with a determined look, started examining the ingredients. This caused his body to emit a powerful golden aura, gradually making the ingredients float. Among the ingredients, there were mushrooms, plants, vegetables, and even a lizard. Lu Sheng told Lingsu that it was time to start with this. Using his power, Lu Sheng began to merge all the ingredients. Several seconds later, once the ingredients had merged, he put them inside the test tube. Lu Sheng extended his hands towards the test tube, causing it to float and emit a golden energy. He began to look at the test tube, and several seconds later he thought it was ready. He removed his mask with his finger and poured the golden liquid from the test tube into his mouth. After drinking the liquid, his expression changed drastically. With a surprised look, he couldn't help but think that this sensation was impressive. He dropped one arm and brought the other hand to his chest. He couldn't believe that this sensation had actually come back again. Now he was the only one who could make a second condensation of the blood pill. While Lu Sheng was holding the blood pill, he turned his head to the side and saw the remains of the ingredients piled up in a corner. Seeing this, he couldn't help but sigh. These materials had cost several billions, and if he wanted all the cells in his body to be replaced with immortal cells, then he needed to obtain many more materials. However, obtaining so many materials would require an astronomical and exaggerated amount of money. Lu Sheng began to touch his chin with his finger, closed his eyes, and remembered that Lingsu's business only generated a few billions per year. Then, he opened his eyes, clenched his fist against his palm, and with a surprised look remembered that he had heard on the internet that if one went to the battlefield and had good skills, then they could earn a lot of money. When thinking about this, Lu Sheng put his hands in his pants pockets, turned his back to Lingsu, and started heading towards the laboratory exit. He thought that there was no time to waste and hoped that the kind internet users were not deceiving him. Several hours later, he went to Bay Airport and sat in the waiting room where some people were talking to each other while others were walking around. Lu Sheng crossed his legs, put one hand in his pants pocket, took out his phone and started looking for some information. Several minutes later, while Lu Sheng was holding the phone in his hand, he tried to call Master Yu, but he didn't answer the call. He began to look at his phone, and with a surprised look, he thought that Master Yu was very busy since he didn't even answer the phone. He came to the conclusion that the plan for Dong Qingsu and Qin Shaojun to come pick him up had also changed. Seeing this, he couldn't help but wonder if the situation on the battlefield was critical, and if they had been called in for an emergency. With a serious look, Lu Sheng turned his head to the side and remained silent for several seconds. While Lu Sheng had one hand in his pants pocket, and with the other he was holding his phone, he turned his head to the side and saw how people were happily enjoying their ordinary lives. The peace they saw here was the result of the soldiers' sacrifice on the battlefield, who gave their blood and lives. Having the opportunity to personally participate in the defense of this tranquility was going to be an honor for him. Lu Sheng slightly turned his head back and with a smile, he remembered that he had seen in the system before that in the depths of the front lines of the Eastern Military District, there were many deposits of rare metals and hidden silver. This area was currently occupied by exotic beasts and was an unexplored zone. He began to imagine himself as a miner and thought that if he wanted to obtain a large amount of wealth in a short time, then he had to go mining. After all, it was an area that had never been excavated before. At that moment, a military fighter jet landed on the airport runway. The girl approached the window, rested both arms on it, and with a surprised look asked her friend why there was also a fighter jet at this airport. Her friend, who was carrying a bag on her shoulder, turned her back to her, and as she was walking away from her, she slightly turned her head towards her and told her that their plane had arrived, and also responded that the reason could be that maybe there was some special mission. After saying this, she asked her friend to follow her as the boarding had already been announced. Lu Sheng stood up and put his hands in his pockets. At that moment, the girl turned her body to the side and saw him. Seeing how handsome he was, she was somewhat surprised. Immediately, she and her friend approached him. She called Lu Sheng handsome boy and asked him if he wanted to join them and also asked where he was going. Upon hearing her voice, Lu Sheng snapped out of his trance, turned his body towards them, and began wondering who they were. He closed his eyes and with a pleasant smile, he explained to her that he was not going on the same plane as them. Upon hearing this, the girl started pointing towards the window, winked at Lu Sheng and told him that there was only one flight that had just been announced. When she saw that he wasn't going to take this flight, she mocked him by asking which one he was going to take. Her friend put her hand over her mouth, closed her eyes, and thought that Lu Sheng was a very interesting person. At that moment, the fighter jet approached the area and stopped right next to them. Several seconds later, the pilot opened the cockpit, turned his body towards them, raised his hand to the sky, and started waving at them. Upon seeing this, the two girls approached the glass and placed both hands on it. With a surprised and confused look, the girl carrying a bag on her shoulder began to wonder why the pilot was greeting them. The other girl also remained somewhat confused and couldn't help but wonder who the pilot was. In the blink of an eye, Lu Sheng left the airport waiting room and appeared on the runway. The pilot exited the fighter jet and began to approach him. He simply put his hands in his pockets and with a serious look, started walking towards them. Upon seeing this, the two girls were shocked as they couldn't believe that a fighter jet had actually come to pick him up. The pilot began to reach out his hand towards Lu Sheng and decided to introduce himself. He approached the pilot and shook his hand. He placed one hand behind his back, started looking at Lu Sheng, and introduced himself as Colonel Qin Huihu from the 1182nd Regiment of the Eastern Military District. He was under the command of Major General Yu Fei. While Lu Sheng was shaking his hand, he began to look into his eyes and with a smile asked him if he was related to Colonel Qin and Qin Shaojun. With a smile, Qin Huihu replied yes, explaining that they were uncle and nephew. Upon looking more closely, Lu Sheng noticed that the badge Qin Huihu wore on his shoulder had 3 arrows and a dot, which meant that his rank was 1 level higher than Dong Qingzu and the others. Qin Huihu turned his back on him and began heading towards the fighter jet. Lu Sheng turned his body towards him and while watching how he was slowly moving away, he caught his attention and asked him if they were now going to the Eastern Military District and also why they hadn't come to look for him. Qin Huihu slightly turned his head towards Lu Sheng and explained that they were not going to the Eastern Military District. After saying this, he began to look up at the sky and with a serious look, He explained to Lu Sheng that due to the appearance of new rifts in the cave, the situation on the front line was very critical, and the commander had been fighting there for several days. Their team was going to reinforce the front line and he was going to take Lu Sheng directly there. Lu Sheng put his hands in his pants pockets as usual, started walking towards him, and with a relaxed look asked how long it would take them to get there. Upon hearing this, Kinu turned his body towards him and couldn't help but be dumbfounded and shocked. He asked Lu Sheng if he wasn't afraid. Lu Sheng distanced himself from him, and as he was heading towards the fighter jet, he started looking at the ground and replied that he didn't care because he actually wanted to go to the front. Upon hearing this, Kinu let his arms drop, turned his body towards him, and couldn't help but wonder if this was the confidence of a young master. He brought his hand closer to his face, started staring at it intently, and remembered that he had been fighting on the battlefield for several years. Until now, he had only reached the peak of level 6. He hadn't even touched the threshold of being a master. He couldn't help but sweat and smile. He didn't even know if he had any hope of becoming a master in this life, since after all, he was already 57 years old. While Lu Sheng was heading towards the fighter jet, he slightly turned his head towards him and with a serious look asked him to briefly tell him about the situation on the front line. Kinu began to look at Lu Sheng and with a serious gaze explained the situation on the eastern front had been very tense, although it had eased up a bit in the last 2 years, but this time a new rift had appeared in the cave, probably classified as level A. This had worsened the situation greatly and the entire eastern front line had to retreat. While Lu Sheng was moving away from him, he turned his head back and upon hearing that the rift was of level A, he asked if rifts in caves were also classified. Kinu extended his hand to the side and calmly replied yes, explaining that rifts were also classified according to the scale and strength of exotic beasts. In a level A rift, at least level 5 beasts would appear, and the depths of the cave were unimaginable. The most difficult rifts were triple S level rifts, and within them, everyone within the range known by humans totaled 9. Fortunately, in the territory of Luang there were none. Lu Sheng was somewhat confused, so he asked him what an A-level rift was. In response, Kinu stared into his eyes, pointed his finger towards the sky and decided to give him an idea. He explained that even a level 8 Grandmaster ran the risk of dying in an A-level rift. Lu Sheng turned his body towards him and upon hearing this, he was somewhat surprised. He asked Kinu if an A-level rift was really that terrifying. He came to the conclusion that then, in double and triple A-level rifts, and even in S-level ones, a martial master at level 9 would have difficulties surviving. Kinu extended his hand towards him and replied that theoretically yes, adding that this could only happen in theory, since no Grand Master or martial artist would venture into the depths of the rifts. As long as one does not venture too far, even an average level 5 or 6 martial artist could survive in a level A rift. Upon hearing this, Lu Sheng began to look at Kinu and couldn't help but smile. He thought that this was like a video game and the rifts were like dungeons. The deeper one went, the more difficult the rift became. But as long as one didn't try to complete it all, facing weaker enemies at first wasn't so dangerous. While Kinu had his hand extended towards him, he began to look into his eyes and with a smile explained that in fact, most of them didn't even need to enter the rift, they just needed to keep their distance and establish a line of defense and wait. Lu Sheng only had to kill the beasts that came out of the rifts, that's how their front line worked. Upon hearing this, Lu Sheng finally understood everything. He clenched his fist tightly, stared at it intently, and thought that if he could completely clear a triple S level rift, then it would be possible to uncover the truth behind the invasion of exotic beasts. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.